this time is just make sure you're being paid. Are you getting paid on YouTube?
Yeah.
That's grand. Just quickly go down to YouTube Studio, and then from there, click on content and live. Just make sure you're being paid.
Where am I
Grand
seeing
for
that
that one.
now?
Because sometimes YouTube turns it off.
Yeah, well, I have, hold on, add channels. Channels on there, though. Do I need to do it with this? You click that on there. Hold on. Well, maybe that should now connect me up.
Yeah.
There we go. Is that working properly?
Rambling Kern.
There we go. And I can see the chat properly now too, which is great.
Oh, that's good.
Sure. Truck on in here.
Well, you're live on your own channel anyway. That's the main thing.
Great. Hello, everyone. We're Digwit.
Irish medieval martial arts with the Rambling Kern. I'll wait for people to start coming in. Oh, Slanta, how's Kevin? How are you keeping today? How's Volt doing? Evening, lads. How y'all keeping? You can see that as well, Kern, can you?
Yeah, that's popping up for me now.
How are you doing, lads? I'm experimenting with the phone, and I can hear an echo, so my own voice is putting me off. But I'm here with the Rambling Kern to talk about martial arts today. Well, during the medieval period, and see the development of it going up to the 20th century. That's my assumption there.
That's fine. It's a tricky topic, like most things in Irish history to talk about. But I mean, we'll kind of get into the meat and veg of it and see where we go with it. But I think obviously the first image to look at is obviously our one from the Book of Kells, and this is probably the most talked about thing when we talk about Irish medieval, fighting, because this is really our earliest and probably most popular image we have of what an Irish warrior looks like. I think that kind of colors everyone's interpretation of it. I mean, there's a lot of stuff even in this picture that just keeps going for the longest time. Obviously, the glibs that we see way later down the line, that haircut looks very similar to that. The lack of shoes, short trousers, but obviously the Irish preference for a spear and a small shield, that was something that you saw talked about for hundreds of years. But I suppose the bit to touch on before we keep going is kind of my stance on recreating martial arts. And I think it is probably one of the trickiest things you could ever attempt to do, especially in the realms of Ireland, because we know so little about what we've actually done here. And most of the recordings we have, the likes of the Book of Kells, they're written by priests, they're not written by soldiers or warriors. So we have very, very scant information as to how these guys did these things or used these things. And a lot of our better information tends to come from later periods, and it's usually the English talking about us and what we did, and usually kind of showboating over us. So my kind of stance on it is it's fun to do, but I find a lot of people I see out there doing it make these very blanket statements, which are very hard to back up. Because in my point of view, as someone who has done martial arts longer than anything else in my life, it's you're always going to color your interpretation of it with the things that you already know. And of course, that's in some ways it's a good thing, but often that can be a bad thing because, let's say, I know you've done karate in the past. That's obviously going to sneak into anything you might do later down the line, subconsciously or not, because it's the frame of reference you have, which can be a very difficult thing when you're looking at stuff like this, because people try to um, kind of shoehorn that stuff in, but
Mm.
it's pretty difficult to look at the ins and outs as to how the stuff was actually done. And usually you're leaving out a lot of the important context behind it. One of the big things I talk about with one of the organizations I train with, the Dog Brothers, who are kind of like a international stick fighting organization, for want of a better term. They kind of do MMA with sticks, I guess would be the best way to explain it.
Yeah.
They use this term of like hierarchical combat, basically like ritualistic combat, which is what you see in boxing or MMA or stick fighting, for example. It's a one-on-one kind of prearranged duel, for want of a better term.
Mm.
And most fighting that we would see historically, that wasn't the done thing, especially in the context of the English. Like, we were renowned for centuries for sneaking out of the trees, ambushing people, and sneaking back into them.
Mm.
Um, and I think a lot of that context, especially that group fighting, gets really left out when we're discussing how we should understand and interpret martial arts from the past. But this is an image I love and one I always end up coming back to, because it is kind of the beginning of everything.
Yeah.
Um, so if we kind of fast forward a tiny bit into the next slide, this is, oh, actually, this one's a great one. So this is, what's the name again? Ian Heath. He did a load of really good artist interpretations of um, Irish Warriors throughout history, and this is his interpretation of the Book of Kells Warrior and what it might have actually looked like.
Mm.
Um, and you can see, I mean, we were only talking about this, how similar the clothing is to way later periods too. It's something that I really love to look at. And obviously the haircut and patch, I mean, that's just peak 80s Ireland right there. Like. But the tiny shields and spears seems to be something that we were very fond of for whatever reason.
Mm.
It's hard to know why exactly. Can't see the image.
That's it. How's that image now, Ryan? Hello, how's everyone doing?
How's everybody this evening or morning, wherever you're in the world?
We're here with the Rambling Kern talking about martial arts, the development of it going from the 9th century, I suppose, from the Book of Kells, all the way up to the 20th century.
Not
I
showing.
can't see
That's
the picture
interesting.
either.
Awkward.
Let's see. I suppose that'd be
How's that?
much better.
Yeah, that should be the full screen now. Let us know if you see that one, folks.
Yeah. No images on your feed. That's very strange. What can you see? That is even stranger. Let me
Hello, Ren.
that's very strange. Oh yeah.
What's
It's
going
booked
on?
up. I'm not sure.
Oh, we've disappeared, but you're not seeing the image. Is that right?
Yeah, let me actually. There is no bloody image. Okay.
Right. Bear with us with that, folks. We'll get this sorted.
That is. Don't forget now, I'm paying. Was it 20 quid all the way up to 80 quid for this? And it books out like that. Technology, huh?
Technology.
Yeah.
Yeah.
On my phone. Yeah, I see that as well.
Yeah, the stone background.
Yeah, I don't know what the hell. Well, I do apologize. I am paying a lot of money for this. And right, I'm not actually sure now. Bloody do.
Yeah, I guess worst case, we just discuss it.
Yeah. Let's just say Restream will get a massive email off me after stealing my 80 quid off me.
Getting a strongly worded email after this.
Oh, insane. I wouldn't mind the other day. The comment section was wasn't popping up on this side. Yeah,
Great.
so how are you keeping? How's Caveman?
Thank you very much, Dave. Well, I mean, Nathan, do you know any Irish craftsmen who could rehilt a dog cutler skiing? I know a few. The best place to check out would be the Forged in Ireland website. You get loads of different blacksmiths on there. I'm on there through some of the other stuff. But
Mm,
yeah, go on there. There'll be a good ton of blacksmiths and find one who kind of suits suits what you're looking for.
uh,
But anyway, back to the fighting and scrapping. I mean the next bit basically, and this is something that you would have seen in the artwork, but something that pops up quite a bit is the Irish using axes that are roughly kind of walking stick length. Now you start to see this pop up kind of around the 11th century and continue through for a few hundred years after that. And you see it in quite a bit of artwork, and you do see it in the Irish Museum. So you do see it in Kildare Street. You get a lot of these quite interesting axes that have quite small heads, very very thin. And obviously, you can tell from the handles because a few of them have remaining handles that they were not especially like long Danax sort of as you'd expect to see. Um, but one thing that was referenced a few times is they're using them basically as like walking sticks. Similar to what you see in, I believe it's the Balkans. Forgive me if I get this wrong, but they're called what's it, a kupa, a shepherd axe. Basically a walking stick slash axe. Um, so and a few people have this theory that a lot of our early preference to kind of carrying a weapon with us in kind of a walking stick length, which may or may not translate later down the line into some of the stick fighting arts we see, kind of pops up during this period. Um, and this is something that I should probably touch on as well, because this is one of my big pet peeves when we talk about Irish martial arts, is that people will look at something from the, say, 18th to 19th century and apply it
mm,
back a few thousand years ago. And you can't really do that with martial arts because the world, like in Ireland over the course of 100 years, at certain points, is wildly different. Like if you look at
mm,
Ireland in, say, 1550 and 1650, it's night and day as to what was going on.
yeah,
Um, and I mean, well, you pick so many different parts of Irish history and do that too. So to say, oh, this thing was definitely influenced by this thing, and it's all the way back, you're kind of clutching at the straws with a lot of stuff. So it is a bit of a pet peeve of mine. Um, just seeing this question coming in a few times here. Were wire monks a thing?
yeah,
Um, as far as I know, no. Now you will probably know this a bit better than me, but I know in a lot of the monasteries around Ireland, they kind of had, for want of a better term, a bit of a protection racket going on with their local lords, where they were,
mm,
it was the local lord's duty to look after them. Um, so a lot of them didn't really have any sort of um need to do that stuff. QPAG Axe, thank you very much. That is
just
exactly the word I
one
was looking for.
second there. I'm just contacting Restream. Sorry about this, Nathan.
Don't
They've
you
gotten
worry.
back to me, and I'm just like, because I'm paying about 90 quid a month, and this is coming out of the Patreon money. So I'm trying to
Mhm.
get this fixed now.
Rightly
And
so, my friend.
but when it comes down to the warrior monks, um, you wouldn't have a martial art warrior monk that I am aware of, but you do have monks fighting on the battlefield. The
Yes.
best imagery is from the Battle of Hastings, where they have a blunt weapon, so they're not allowed to kill, but they can come blunt damage, which you can see in the blunt of in the Battle of Hastings in the tapestry. They have a monk, and he's basically dressed as everyone else, riveted mail, helmet. Just he has a blunt weapon, a mace or a mallet to whack somebody with. But other than that, exactly the same thing.
Well, actually, on that note, this is something I was, you kind of gloss over because you think of them as knights, but I mean, the Templars and the Hospitallers had a big stronghold in Ireland, and I guess you could call them warrior monks in some ways because that was kind of their duty. In a lot of ways, they were more so knights than monks, but that is probably our closest thing in Europe to,
Mm,
the warrior monks you would see in Asia. But not in the Viking period, unfortunately. The
mm,
the monks at that time were much more into writing scripts and making mead from what I've seen.
Yeah,
Um,
sadly.
I don't know. We got some good stuff out of them, in fairness.
Yeah.
Um, but obviously, the kind of leads us into our next period when we talk about kind of the fighting that was done in Ireland. The big thing really that kind of happens around the Viking Age, and obviously really gets pushed over the edge by the Normans, is archery.
Mm,
There's this really strange period in Ireland where it's not even a case of archery's not a thing. It's a case of we haven't even found like any bows.
mm,
You kind of get into the late Bronze Age, and they almost disappear completely from Ireland, and then reappear around the kind of Viking invasions, and then they kind of take off in their own way. And I've done videos on this, and you've given me a shout out on those, so big thank you. But you do see in later periods really, really interesting bows start to pop up, and something that if I can get hold of a nice bit of I would love to try to recreate, because you get what are called bullwing bows. So this is a term I've seen applied to Native American bows that are very, very similar in design. Um, and actually, before I touch on that, because I saw his name escapes me, but another YouTuber who was looking to see if he could find a cross section short bow in Irish history. For want of a better term, Aragorn's bow that you would see in Lord of the Rings. He was trying to see could he find the equivalent anywhere in Europe, and he couldn't. And immediately, as soon as I saw the video, I went, yeah, but there's loads of them in Ireland. We actually find quite a few in and around Waterford. We have lovely examples of these kind of like 4 foot D-sec cross section bows. Um, so we really get into archery quite heavily in the country. Obviously, very affected by England and what they were up to. One thing people don't even think about is like we were exporting for longbows into England for quite an extensive period. I know y'all in and around Cork was doing it for quite some time. Obviously, a lot of that was consumed pretty quickly. I know Poland, if I remember right, basically all of the was gone after I think about 50 years. So you couldn't find it anywhere because they were importing so much into England.
mm.
Living anachronism, that is the exact one. Thank you very much, Ryan. Um, I plan on recreating that bow. That was, if anyone saw the oak bow I made for a friend of mine, there's an old medieval technique where you can turn oak dark black. You can ebonize it by using vinegar. Um, I plan on making an oak short bow and staining it to make it look like Aragorn's, because obviously I'm a Lord of the Rings fan. Um, but that kind of preference for short bows seems to be something that the Irish carried on for quite a while, and
Mm,
the Scots as well seems to really like. Unfortunately, the only bow of that design, the Goldwing type, I should say, which looks like almost looks like a kind of shrunken down, like recurve, like almost kind of what you'd expect to see as an Asiatic horse bow.
mm.
Um, and you see it in the uh, who would have seen it in the slide? I forget the name. Um, you see it pop up in a few different artworks. The very famous one was a Galaglas holding one in his hand, and a big, great sword over his shoulder.
Mm,
But you see that design pop up, and there was one found, and unfortunately, it was lost. As has happened to a few really amazing things in the Irish Museum, it just disappeared. We have a few pictures of it, and that is a really interesting bow. One I'd love to recreate, because I think it's a really fascinating bit of Irish history where we just gain this like big love of bows, but
mm.
it just seems to disappear. What would be the most used axe during 1850 to 950? Albert, Matt, you're on the money today, right? Thank you very much. That is the exact straw that I'm thinking of, which is an interesting picture in itself. That one deserves its own podcast, because that drawing was basically him seeing Irish kerns and gabelgas on campaign in
Mm.
Flanders, I believe it is.
Yeah.
So some of the details are a little bit iffy, but a lot of it is quite spot on. The
Mm.
bow in it actually he gets back to front. He gets the woods the wrong way around on it.
Oh, really?
Because yeah, so U has very specific. The outside of it, the bit
Mm,
closest to the outside world is sapwood. It's white, and the inside is like a kind of a dark, kind of honey brown color. And he has it flipped on the bow, which is it's a good detail that he got in there, but obviously he messed it up. Um, a question on axes. I think every historian will say these sort of things. It depends. 850 to 950, you're going to see a pretty broad range of axes in Ireland.
mm.
Um, you'll see the hand axes. You'll see big, massive Dane axes. The one big thing, though, and this is something if we're talking about martial arts, especially, is how the axes are made. So I actually I was out cutting blackthorn for making walking sticks the other day, so I actually have a hatchet
Oh,
next to me.
nice.
Um, if they're shaped like this, and this is actually a pretty good example for a hatchet, they're not fighting axe. Fighting
Mm,
axes tend to not have such a severe amount of material here. Usually it's gets very thin very fast and almost flares out here at the blade. So basically, if this has more material here, it'll cut and go right the way in until it meets some sort of resistance. Whereas axes like this want to split stuff open.
mm,
It's a big mistake you'll see both with interpretations of it and people's understanding of it, because some fighting axes, like replicas I've held, will be like the head would weigh almost the same as a hatchet, but obviously expanded out into a big two-hander, which is something I see get wrong a lot because a lot of people kind of come from their what they know. I
mm.
talked about this in a recent video of mine. Kind of what I was saying is, when you're trying to recreate an art, you tend to just push in the things which you know colours your opinions and usually end up getting a lot of stuff wrong.
Mm, mm.
Um,
I can imagine.
but I suppose the other one that gets talked about while we're on the topic of ranged weapons will be slings. There is a big Irish tradition of using them. The
Mm,
latest reference I've found for people using and training with slings is from the 1950s, from the crowd in Galway. Apparently,
mm,
lads used to do competitions with them, hitting tins off of walls and stuff. Now, if that goes right the way back, I don't know. But obviously, our earliest references is Cuchulainn and the stuff he was getting up to, taking out Maeve's guards and all that. Which we have some really amazing references going right the way back to then of the use of the sling. But if that keeps going for into the Viking period and into the medieval period, it doesn't really seem to.
mm.
Um, so the maybe that's what happened. Maybe we got rid of our bows and picked up slings, and then the bows came back to realize how good they are.
It's
Um,
possible, all right, because it gets very popular with the Romans, isn't it? The sling.
mm,
So it could be a
100%.
case, especially when you're dealing with so much close quarter combat, because of the fact that Ireland is very boggy, very tree. Maybe that was the advantages. Although on the southeast side, we do see the return of the longbow going into the late medieval period, don't we? With the
Yeah.
arrival of the Fitzgeralds using the longbow much more. But I
See,
think
I
that's more
think
on the southeast side.
I think that's actually a really interesting point because this is something again that kind of touch on when we're recreating arts. I think one thing that really gets ignored when we talk about Ireland is why the fighting was the way it was. So we always talk
Mm,
about Irish being known for hit and run tactics, and the main
yeah,
reason for that is because there was forts everywhere.
yeah,
Um, every kind of town had some sort of small fortification either in it or next to it.
mm,
Um, I've seen a lot of interesting theories as to why Ireland is just absolutely dotted with ring forts.
yeah,
Um, one interesting one I've seen kind of brought up recently, which kind of struck a struck a spark in my head, was that cattle raiding being such a big thing.
yeah,
If you're putting your cows in, a lot of those ring forts might well have just been cow sheds because a lot of them don't have there's no source of water, there's no way to actually like live in them.
mm,
Um, so it's quite possible they just use as cow pens to prevent people robbing them. But
yeah.
that also really leads on to later periods, like you said, with the Normans and stuff, because our our armies and our armaments were then really tailored to defending towns. Like you
Yeah,
see that in Dublin,
it's
you
very
see it in
true.
Waterford, in Limerick, like all the kind of English commentators. That's kind of what they were doing, was saying you have to have X, Y, and Z um, weapons to defend town walls.
Mm. It was mostly while I was doing my study for castles. I know this was massive change between conventional style castles that we can see in the southeast of the country, which was taking on a lot of techniques and architecture types that we see in the Crusades, England, France. But then I noticed in the northwest side of the island, we had these tower houses that were influenced by Scandinavia and Scotland, not just because of the geography of it, but they were less conventional style conventional style fighting, and more kind of defensive, and also great for protecting cattle during cattle raid and stuff. So I noticed the style of fighting completely changed, and you could see that with the architecture, especially to do with castles and stuff. And then on top of that as well, the development of armor, especially in the 13th century. Sorry, not the 13th century. The early 15th century was very much influenced by France, but we can see full plate armor, at least in the southeast of the island, around 1399. But then in the northwest side, especially when you look at manuals to do with the likes of the Berg and stuff, in the northwest, much more lighter, you know. So that was just my little investigation.
Yeah, and it's that's actually a great point too. I think people gloss
Mm.
over is just how much continental Europe influenced the Irish, especially with oh, we get an echo back. Um,
Right.
with later periods, oh,
Is that okay there? Is it?
perfect. I think like when we start to look at later periods, especially like with the Kerns, as we
Mm,
come to know them in the 16th century, um, like the especially with the Reformation going on and everything else, like the massive influence that the church has on Ireland through Italians and Spanish, and obviously French and later communities too, is really really significant because the amount of weapons that were getting imported, like firearms, like pikes, swords, um, it's one of the things I picture in my head because it probably was quite common to see an Irish Kern with a nice Spanish rapier. It
mm,
would not be beyond the realms of popular belief, even though we did have swords that we were producing ourselves.
mm,
Um, but I would imagine most of those would have been made in continental Europe anyway. Um, so it would be very interesting how much of an influence the continental warfare had on the Irish, especially the training they may not have received. Um, because right away back, I think into I'm getting my dates right. I think the 14th century is when we first started to see the Irish hobblers and horsemen in the service of the English,
mm.
right away across the north of France,
Yeah, you bet.
who were remote on quite a few people, by being quite a nuisance. Um, And the final bit on slings, and I've only seen this brought up once in the context of Ireland, and maybe if I'm getting my details right, I think there's once with a reference of an Irish guy using it in France, is staff slings. They really don't get enough appreciation because they are a super weapon for defending stuff. Um, but let's see, a few interesting questions coming in here. Good thing about Ireland. That is very true. Um, skills of slings. It's really evidence of slings, long
Give us one
crossbows.
second there. I just want to check that.
No bother. Um, on your question about sling and stone crossbows there, Brian, I would say you seem to have two streams going simultaneously. Hmm. Don't know what's going on there.
Yeah, Ryan, we've got to multi-stream on the go.
Oh yeah,
That's
on
also
both
the
channels.
problem with the photos. See if that's working
Uh,
now. But
let us know if you see a photo there, folks.
yeah.
um, but yeah, on that question of crossbows, I don't know of any stone bows in Ireland. The earliest crossbow that I know of, or at least evidence of a crossbow, is from the tail end of the Viking period. Found just outside the walls of Dublin. If you ever get the opportunity, I think it's since gone out of print, but if you're in the Irish Museum, sometimes you can pick them up. Is the book by Andrew Halpin on the weapons and warfare in Viking Dublin, I think it's called. It's like it was released by the National Museum. Still snowflakes. Yeah. Um, it has a load of really good stuff, but it also has the roller knot, which is none of the crossbows found, but the actual piece that makes a crossbow function, and where you hold the string, was found outside the walls. So we do know crossbows were used quite extensively in later periods, but right the way up till probably the middle of the oh, year 1000 or so.
Mm.
Roughly around then. Don't hold me to it, but roughly around then is where we start to see crossbows appearing. And again, in defense of towns. Dublin has some really mad arrows and arrowheads found around it, which again ties back into that thing I was saying of cities being the kind of center of warfare in Ireland for quite a long period, right? But really the kind of Tudors come in and start burning everything to the ground,
Mm.
which ties us nicely on to the next bit, which is our Kerns. So obviously this is big area of love for me. The one thing to 3 more Irish shorts are made by Neela. Excellent to see. I know a lot of people have contacted me to ask if Neela would make them Irish shorts. People have probably seen the video I made ages ago. If any of you haven't, there's one on my channel just of me reviewing a sword I got made by Neela Swords,
Oh,
which
nice.
is an exact replica of an Irish kind of amalgamation of kind of 2 or 3 Irish ring hilt swords. Most people get them really wrong when they're making them. And the one big thing I would say as well with Irish swords is uh, get the handles made how they were originally. I made the mistake of getting the handle made like an inch bigger, and I immediately regretted that when I got it. It doesn't sound like a lot, but you'll see in the image I would have pulled up after the quick if you want to look at that one up. This is one of my thoughts of what the artist was trying to get at with that, where he has the tops of the swords are like comically big, they kind of flare out like this. I think that was his way of donating that the swords were really top heavy. And it's something that happens in Ireland where the Scots basically start to make hollow swords, so like hollow pommeled swords,
Yeah,
that
that's
are
still not
very
working, by the way. Sorry about that.
no bother. Um,
I'm doing
I think
exactly what they're telling me, and no results.
nothing.
No,
Uh,
I'll
we
keep
getting a
pounding them there. They owe me money.
worded letter for that.
Oh,
But the Scots have this real preference for these fellow pommel swords, which I think is probably where we kind of get the idea to start moving them. But they're very chop orientated. They're very much a chopping sword. The only swords I've seen like that will remind me of them will be like the Indian tulwars, where it's like a disc where you just wedge your hand in and just chop away at people. Which makes sense because we used weapons that were just completely archaic in the 16th century. We were using stuff that wouldn't seem out of place like 2 or 3 centuries before. Um, but my big kind of ideas around Irish warfare and Irish weaponry at the time really ties into what a lot of what we see in the King Edward used Irish hoppers against the Scots. Interesting. I have to look up more, Brian. Um, the Where's it going with that? Oh yeah, it really ties into a lot of what we see in the artwork with the Kerns. And one thing we see pop up constantly is carrying gauntlets, which is really fascinating in my mind because you had these guys who just weren't wearing armor whatsoever, yet over and over in artwork they have a left-handed gauntlet. No right-handed gauntlets. And you would think they would have one on the sword arm, never do. It's almost always in the left arm, and it's very interestingly, in 1 or 2 artwork pieces, it's shown like hung around the neck, like dangling all the way down to the feet, um, which is really unusual. A bit of a mad way to wear a bit of armor, but obviously was important to the Irish. And my theory, a roundabout way of me saying it, is the Irish were renowned for using wicker shields, and I think it ties into that. Um, I think part of it is obviously fighting with it. We see it in the after the quick drawing, something that I teach in stick fighting, where you basically try to stuff the person's attacking arm, reaching your hand forward. Drawn after the quick, that's the one. Yes, no image, still not visible.
Yeah, don't use
Yeah.
Restream. I give it a bad review. 80 quid for nothing.
But I've spoken to a few people about the possibilities of how the Irish are making wicker shields. There was a great fella, if those who are Instagram, I should have looked his name up prior, but I think it's the Old Crafty, but fantastic weaver and basket maker. He was chatting to me about it. There's a thing, I should remember the name. I think it's called the Creel or something like that, but it's an old potato basket, basically, is what we were using it for. Yeah, Eld Crafty, Tom Delaney. Shout out to him. He was telling me that there's a preference in Ireland for these like very sturdy, very big wicker like baskets for want of a better term, but they're not baskets. It's like a domed, what do you even call it? Like plate, essentially, for carrying potatoes on. And made to be super sturdy. And I think a lot of what you would see with those will be a lot. What I imagine wicker shields are, from what we're hearing from accounts, will be that's what they will be used, similar design to that. So my idea is that you would have that left hand gauntlet behind it, and if someone were to chop through it, or you'd almost invite them to chop into the shield, get it bound up, and then you could have at them. So interesting one Brian brought up there about Scottish firearms. I wish I could find the reference, but I was reading a really interesting piece recently about it was an English commentator. I think he was witnessing a fight between two groups of Scots, and noticed how they were all firing arrows at each other, and kind of laments how he wished the English had kept up their tradition of using bows. And it's something you actually see right the way up into the wars in Sweden, where the Irish mercenaries shown um, with bows. So it's like, I think the picture is attributed to, I think it's like 1630. I could be getting this wrong, but you see two Irish lads with the almost the same kind of recurved bows slung over their shoulders. In Sweden, let me see. Pretty sure it's the 1600s. It is indeed 1631. There we go. Now we'll do this the old-fashioned way, folks. But here's the image I'm talking about.
There you go.
As you can see, Irish fellas, we do have one fellow with a musket, and then another fellow with another fellow with a bow and a sword at the hip. So again, kind of shows that, and you see they're very, very Scottish looking in style. But we do have that preference for firearms in Ireland, but then bows seem to be stuck around for quite a while. And someone asked, boiled leather on shields. Not that I'm so I've seen reference to leather being wrapped around the shields, and some to like layers of cloth being wrapped around them. I really recommend the Wild Irish guys, WYLDE. They have a really good write up on this um on their website. So I recommend it. Go and have a look at it. Yeah, that picture, they do look like Scots, but they are in fact Irish. As you'll actually see right there, Irish soldiers in the service of Gustavus Adolphus in 1631. And the 1600s is kind of where, like, obviously everything changes completely, and it's the beginning of where martial arts, like the actual martial arts that we can legitimately say we do know about, begins. Because that is where obviously Cromwell comes in and does all the nasty stuff that he does. But off the back of that, we get a huge proportion of the Irish eventually ending up in the 1700s in the British Army, which is where a lot of our early books and manuals start to come from. Is Irish people, excuse me, with the fight of the wild geese. Some of them who end up in continental Europe. We see books from them talking about fencing, and we see books in from guys who are in the British Army who are talking about that as well. So probably the three famous ones. And there is a fourth, which is in Ben Miller's book. I highly recommend if anyone's interested in Irish military history. Ben Miller wrote a book, I believe it's called Irish Swords and Swordsmanship. It's like a big phone book of a book. It's worth every penny getting hold of. He also has a fencing manual published in the back of it. Um, the three books we have are Gregory Doyle, Alexander Doyle, and Tom Lonergan. So I believe both Doyles were in continental Europe, and they're both fencing, small sword fencing treatises. So slightly later into the 1700s, but we know for sure um, a pretty good understanding of that's probably how a lot of Irish, at least who had access to those sort of weapons, were fighting at the time. Lonergan's probably the most interesting because he was, I believe, a Tipperary man. Um, if anyone's from Tip and I get it wrong, apologies. But I'm pretty sure he's from Tipperary, and he joins the British Army, and he writes a very, very good book on fighting with the broadsword, so the basket hilt broadsword, not the various other names that have been given to it. So that is probably the closest we know is what Irish soldiers, at least, were fighting like. Really, really good book. Really explains how that stuff was done and how that sort of you would expect Irish soldiers to fight at that time. And probably one of the most famous Scottish fencing masters of all time. And as soon as I went to talk about me, just his name slipped out of my head. Jesus, why can't I think of it? But he's lived in Ireland for a bit as well. And talks about how the Irish were fighting at that time. But the one interesting little tidbit we have of Irish and how we were fighting, and this is where the waters get awfully murky. Is people like to, especially when we look at like the Kerns and that kind of period from the kind of 15 into the 1700s, Ireland was decimated. The population, there's numerous stuff like famines. Obviously, the Tudor invasions were pretty horrific, and then Cromwell did what he did, and then there was a lot of natural disasters and stuff that happened at the back of that. So the population was not in a good way, and we're obviously being pretty heavily suppressed by the penal laws, which is where a lot of our later, um, understanding of martial arts comes about. Because obviously that's where Irish stick fighting comes from. Um, and you do have a lot of people who kind of make wild assumptions as to the origins of stuff in that period, even though we don't really have any kind of accurate information to say one way or the other. The one thing I would say is obviously the use of the pike and the spear is something that just Donald McBain. Thank you very much, Stephen. Stephen, big shout out to Stephen Curtin. He is an absolute legend. And as absolute scholar in the world. He's always popping in my channel with really good information. McBain is indeed the man who was served in Ireland for a bit. I believe got in trouble for sleeping with someone's wife while here. We could be wrong. But the that period anyway, those 15 1600s, people make a lot of assumptions as like, Grant are doing this, people are doing that. We don't really know, but there is one tiny snippet. I was trying to find the photo for you before I came on, but doesn't matter now anyway.
Okay.
We have one manual, one fighting manual written in Irish, from to the foundation of the state, and it's how to use the pike, which is fascinating. So I think if I get my dates right, it was kind of used it was written in the kind of late 1700s. Um, Now it's basically like 4 paragraphs. It's just like, if they try stab you, you stab them, but it's all in Gaelic, which is it's fascinating because it's one of the few actual bits of information we have written by Irish people at a period where Irish people weren't writing anything about fighting and warfare, saying like, here's what we did. Um, what type of bows do we see in Erin? You for almost all of them. Almost every bow that we see made in Ireland was you. Right the way back to from the Bronze Age, right the way through to the I believe the oldest one that I was talking about is perhaps the 1400s, maybe
Mm,
1500s. But that one went missing, so I think it's be impossible to date that one anyway. They're almost all you. There's one or two that are elm, and that's basically it. Used to be quite a good bit of you found in the country, but just not been not something you can really find easily these days unless you go raid in a church. But they usually don't like you doing that either. and
yeah.
it, and the different families of you too. So a lot of people try putting there's certain types that are just they're dreadful for using for making bows. Um, but the final period we need to talk about is that phase of kind of 16 into 1700. That's when things kind of fall into the categories that we now know. So the one bit I would say, the one art I would say that is probably the oldest, and the oldest surviving, but doesn't really survive in Ireland, unfortunately. And I'll touch on why. But probably the oldest surviving art, with most likely the most legitimate claim to actually have been practiced by Cuchulainn, is backhold wrestling or barrog. Now that remained in Scotland and still remains. It's still part of hurling games today. Unfortunately, the great body that is the GAA did stomp out most recreational forms of fighting. Boxing and wrestling were included as part of it. Um, they didn't like it. They weren't really a fan of it. Um, but Barrog is probably the one that we can truly agree went right the way through, which is just dictated by this over the back grip. You kind of grip like this over the back, and cannot break the grip, and you have to just throw your other opponent on the floor. Um, we do then start to see color and elbow rise up right in about the end of the 1700s into the 1800s, which I'll talk about more at the end because we have lots of stuff coming with that. So definitely one to talk about. But as I see Brian there mentioned Bataracht. Um, Bataracht obviously takes off as a result of the penal laws. The quote I always joke about is, the Gandalf thing of like you wouldn't deprive an old man of a stick. And that's kind of how the Irish get away with carrying sticks around.
Mm,
But something that I find people don't talk about when they talk about martial arts in general is, especially in a historic setting, is how fond people were of blood sports back in the day.
mm,
Um, there was a lot of bull baiting, cockfighting, dog fighting, a lot of that stuff going on in around Ireland. There was a very much a big fondness for recreational violence, for want of a better term.
mm,
And stick fighting was part of that. Every fair you'd see lads wrestle, and every fair you would see guys in later periods start to box. Um, One bit of interesting kind of Irish martial arts history that never gets talked about, and again, Ben Miller has a book on it, so another hot tip to him is the stage gladiators. They're guys who just really get ignored. Would make a fantastic film if anyone in China is works in films, suggest a film about the stage gladiators because they were really really interesting. And basically, these people agreed to fight on stage, and these were legitimate fights. It was like to first blood, and you would
mm,
usually fight through a series of weapons. So depending on the period, it would be like a like quarterstaff, a broadsword, and usually broadsword and something else. So broadsword and targe or broadsword and buckler, um, and then it would be unarmed of some sort. And unarmed was like boxing, but boxing at that period was very much more akin to like MMA today, like throws and slams and stuff were allowed, and you could grapple and knock them and punch you in the face and all that sort of fun stuff. Um, but they would do this in successive rounds, and even in Ireland, there was a very famous couple, a man and a wife, who used to fight together. They would fight male and female opponents, and they would travel to London. There was I believe it's called the Bear Pit in London, again because it was used for bear baiting,
mm,
and that was just such a really interesting like bit of motivation. It just completely gets glossed over. But these were really legitimate fighters and soldiers, but and martial artists, I should say. It just really never really gets mentioned. You try
Mm.
and that's the image solution again.
Oh, I'm arguing with Restream at the site, and they're telling me to do A, B, and C, and I'm just like, okay, and it's not working. So,
Grand, grand back pushing button. But the penal laws obviously are what kick off the faction fights. Um, I believe, if I'm getting my history right, it's the 1830s that really kicks them off properly. And that was because a lot of that's where landlords are basically responsible for their tenants and their tenants' safety. So prior to the Great Famine that we all know, there was a lot of earlier famines that forced a lot of change into Irish law. And the 1830s, I believe, is when the big one happens, where landlords were essentially tasked with, if you have a tenant on your land, you have to be able to kind of sustain them. So should a famine happen, you got to be able to provide some form of food for them. So what a lot of landlords did was say, grand, we'll kick them off the land. And a lot, basically, you see a lot of these kind of gangs getting formed, a lot of the secret societies, a lot of which traveled over to the States and are still there. So you have like the likes of the Whitefeet, that terrible Tom Cruise movie with him and Nicole Kidman.
oh yeah,
I forget the name of it, but he played one of these fellas, and the best Irish accent we've seen on screen. Um, these secret gangs were formed all over. A lot of these gangs were factions, was the name that was kind of attributed to them,
mm.
and that's where the faction fights started to happen. So a lot of these groups were kind of. It depends where you are in Ireland. It depends where you are as to they were, what they were made up of. So in the cities, especially in Dublin, there's a great book one of my students lent to me about faction fighting in the city of Dublin, and a lot of that was tied to the guilds. So the two biggest who were at each other's throats were the weavers and the butchers. So in Dublin 8, you still have a lot right where I used to live for about a decade. You still have Weaver Street, and you still have up towards. Why can't I think of the name of it? I used to train on that street for years. Up towards Christchurch, they had a lot of butchers. There's still quite a few traditional butchers along that street, and they used to fight each other constantly, and got quite violent. Um, but this same thing we see in the countryside is kind of the same thing that we see in the city, where a lot of people try to avoid deaths with these faction fights, because if deaths occurred, the law was called in, and the law at the time was the army, which would result in people being shot. So one of the bigger fights that those two groups had in the city centre resulted in quite a number of people being shot the following days. Um, Whereas in the countryside, what we tend to see is a lot of disputes over land. So we see familial groups, and we see kind of workman groups. So the Whitefeet being a real famous one from, I believe it's Kilkenny, and they were called Whitefeet because they worked in a limestone mine, and they just had limestone all over the boots, so they were called the Whitefeet. Um, and that's where a lot of the stick fighting factions kind of pop up. Um, Game of boxing and stick fighting techniques are said to be tied together. So, um, oh, hold on, we got the echo coming back. Are we good now? Yeah, we're good now. I just which that's not what we're looking at. What is the name of it? Hold on. This is gonna be in my head now. What Tom Cruise movie that was. Um, it's an absolutely dreadful movie, but uh, Far and Away, 1992. That's the one. A very young Tom Cruise, but he has one of the best Irish accents I've ever seen on screen. So it's worth it just for that. So this thing of the boxing stick fighting techniques being tied together. So um, this might be a bit of trouble for saying this, but um, there is claims in some of the Irish stick fighting groups that is the or some of the styles, I should say, that the arts were evolved from pugilism and that way of fighting. Um, as someone who's boxed at an amateur level, I'm by no means a particularly talented boxer, but I have stepped in the ring, and I also teach two of the surviving stick fighting styles. I don't really see the the crossover, and I've practiced pugilism as well. So what I'm going to be a pugilism is like bare knuckle boxing. I'm due to go over to the States this year and train with Tom War Yoga, who some of you might have seen on Sensei Seth's channel. I'm talking about bare knuckle boxing. Um, there is some people who make that claim. I don't see it. I don't see the crossover. Um, Stick fighting, which I had a lot of images to with this, but um, this is probably the biggest crux of what I was getting at right earlier on when I was chatting to Phil there, was that people forget the context that the fighting was done in. So I talked about one-on-one fights earlier, and that being like a very unique thing to what we do now. Like if you go into a martial arts class, you're probably going to be paired with a person, and if you're going to spar, you're fighting one-on-one. Um, if we look at any period in Irish history with the fighting that we had being done, bar the few examples of fencing, which were done by gentlemen for sport, which is more similar to what we're doing today. But if we look at um, Irish stick fighting, these were gang fights. These were mass brawls. Women were also involved in them. There was like rules around how women could be involved in them. But the big thing with a stick fight is that you basically would have two groups face off, and there was basically an area in between that you did not want to step into. And these guys would be throwing rocks at each other, and they would be stick fighting. And you see this in like certain tribes in Africa that still do this for the fun of it. But you see a lot of why the arts are shaped the way they are, the stick fighting styles, because
Mm.
with one of the styles I teach, it's very much about um, trying at long range to make sure that you're like keeping yourself away and utilizing your range as best as you can. And with the other style, it's very much about getting right in on top of the guy so that he can't swing at you. Um, which in a one-on-one fight is very difficult to do because the guy can backpedal. But in a group fight, he's stuck. He's got someone behind him, so it really takes away the ability to do that. That's something that I see rarely get discussed when we're talking about martial arts in Ireland and why they are the way that they are.
Mm.
Um, so infections were indeed essential labor guilds. Um, so I mean the stick fighting itself kind of is the one thing that we do know kind of remains and kept going. And but like I said earlier, the best bit of conjecture we have is that these arts might have come from a preference in Ireland for using walking sticks and walking stick like objects right the way back to guys carrying axes as walking sticks. But in reality, I mean, that's almost half a millennia apart. So the likelihood of those being connected is fairly slim. Um, Stick fighting as a pastime and as like kind of a cultural thing was stomped out primarily by two major bodies in Ireland, the Catholic Church and the GAA. The GAA did a lot to get rid of recreational violence.
We can't have any
Um,
competition now, you know.
yes, yes, which is unfortunate because even a lot of their own arts they got rid of, like handball they got rid of. There's handball courts all over the country that are just no longer there because they refused to finance it.
Mm.
And someone I wish I could remember the name. The fella doing a documentary on it at the moment about the handball courts that are still there and they're just
Mm.
abandoned. Um, because I believe there's quite a few official sports under the GAA umbrella, but it's only hurling and football that you see these days. You don't see the rest of it.
Mm.
Um, yeah, the fight. Yes, indeed. So the church obviously they do stomp out a lot of the fighting that we see and the efforts to do it in a recreational way, and then obviously the the Great Famine, and then into World War I, and then obviously out the back of World War I, we have the Rising, we have Civil War, we have World War II. Most of the young men in Ireland at those periods just kind of got rid of most of those pastimes, which is very unfortunate because um, if anyone's interested, Dukas, who the National Folklore Archive, it's one of the most interesting things in Irish history. Again, if anyone's looking to make a movie, Really recommend you go and make a movie about that because uh, off the back of the famine, they had this great idea that a lot of Irish people were illiterate, and a lot of them would not leave any record when they asked about Irish history. So they went around with ediphones, which are like these wax cylinders, like early vinyl, essentially, these massive things on the back of bicycles, and recorded Irish people just talking about anything, literally
Mm.
anything, like stories, the weather. One of the fellows in Evercloud was telling me that they had someone who purely out of memory could recite this story that was like longer than the Iliad, and they remembered,
Jeez.
and it was a traditional Irish story, and they remembered the entire thing, and they could recite any part of it to you. Um, and we have a load of people talking about stick fighting and wrestling at that period. Um, and they did successive ones later as well. Really, really insightful thing to do. Um, but unfortunately, most of the people involved in those martial arts just passed off. The two stick fighting arts that we have surviving, we have the Doyle style, as a lot of people probably aren't familiar with, but I'm sure a few people who watch these channels will be. The Irish, like almost entire towns, just up and left to Canada, and you
Mm.
had like fully Irish speaking towns in Canada, which is where the Doyle style comes from. And then you have the Antrim style, which is one that a lot of people don't know a lot about. But the current head of the Antrim style, he still lives in County Antrim. Um, I won't say too much about him, but basically he was involved in politics in the north of Ireland and didn't want to be attached to something that could be deemed as violence. So, fair play to him. But he taught the current guy who heads up the Antrim style of battle act, and it's one that is luckily still remained. And outside of that, we have collar and elbow wrestling, which again, unfortunately, died off. It was at one point the most popular style of combat sports in the entire Western world,
Jeez, that's a
um,
shame.
ab- above boxing, because it was one of the few um, styles of martial arts that ladies were allowed to go and visit and to watch because it was not violent in the way that boxing was, or not as
Mm.
bloody, I should say. Um,
Yeah, I can imagine.
so it was often thought it was kind of fencing with the feet, and I believe there was championships held well all across North America and then as far as New Zealand and Australia. Um, but unfortunately, by the 1930s, it's kind of when we see the last few references to it, and then it just kind of died off. But last week we relaunched, or I should say, launched the Irish Collar and Elbow Wrestling Federation. So
Oh, that's
our
brilliant.
big push this year is to get that up off the ground. We have a competition already agreed for um, the No Fame Games, which are a set of Highland Games in Boston in June. We also have our first Connacht Championships. We are in the line to do a Ulster Championship and a Munster Championship as well this year. So big, big year for Irish martial arts. But I guess that is my 1 hour quick and dirty rant on Irish martial arts from 900 to 1900. Um, but yeah, I mean, while I'm here, does anyone have any questions?
Yeah, for sure. It is very interesting. I'm just getting the echo back there.
No, no
What I
worries.
might do actually is turn up the sound on this side and actually turn on the other one.
Nice. Thank you. Stephen, I didn't actually know that Spencer was writing about that. Now I know Spencer writes a few mean things about the Irish, but I didn't know he was saying that walking stick axes were a thing. I must actually look and see if there's any further explanations of what they look like, because it would be definitely something I'd love to get made. Um, I think the style will change to suit the stick. So this actually ties into recreating of styles. One thing that we see happen and mentioned quite a bit is that the south of Ireland, Cork and Kerry area, were renowned for fighting with two sticks. We have no idea what that looked like, unfortunately. We have no reference, not even the foggiest idea of what the sticks look like. Were they the same size? Were they short and long? We have loads of names in Irish for types of fighting sticks. And we know from them they range from about 6 inches to 12 inches, right the way up to about 6 to 7 feet. Um, and a lot of these had like agricultural uses. So the kipping being the smallest one, that was used for similar to what you'd see like a fisherman used today for just knocking fish on the head, or like breaking up stuff around the house. And the really long ones, I think, were called a wattle, which is basically used for driving cattle, which you still see similar ones being used today. Um, Generally, most Irish stick fighters, what we see in the artwork, was they were used for like walking sticks. And they evolved into swagger sticks in the like 19th century or 1900s, I should say, in England. So you have these, still actually is a thing in the British Army. You can get swagger sticks commissioned as a officer in certain branches. Excuse the pun, of the British military, and which are blackthorn, just blackthorn walking sticks, but they're much thinner. I mean, they're usually the ones that you see thorns on because they're not meant to be held anyway other than the head. Ever touch anything to fighting sticks, like razors, nails, or something along the lines? So, this is a good question because this is something that I have ranted about a few times. So there's this late friend, maybe you probably appreciate this, Philip, as someone who lives in Japan, of course influencing the market. Traditional fighting sticks never had lead in them. I know three examples that had lead in them. And these were, one was decoration, to basically put like carved a little cross in it and poured some lead in. One was like this really horrible knotty bit of wood, and they just put some lead in to kind of fill up the holes. And the other one was basically the exact same as the second. Um, did they put razors, nails, and whatnot on it? No. The main reason being these lads didn't want it to look like a weapon. If you're carrying around like a big spiked baseball bat in today's world, it's very clearly a weapon. If you're carrying around a real baseball bat and a baseball, you can argue that you play baseball. Very similar ideas to what was being done in Ireland at the time. Like, you were not allowed to own weapons, and that included things that you could modify into weapons. So like you see that with people hiding bike heads around their house and stuff. I know a few people who found bits of bikes and stuff up in attics over the years in Ireland for very similar reasons. Um, yeah. We're on mute there, so
It's very strange.
there we go.
Yeah. I thought the other mic would start working because I keep getting an echo, which is really
I gotcha.
putting off for me. So I tried fixing it there, and it's not doing what it's supposed to do.
No bother at
But
all.
I'll just hammer through anyway. But it's interesting how with the penal laws, the Irish are now trying to hide the weapons, if anyone's unaware about that, because so what we had is from the Tudor conquest onwards, you have the English trying to take over the island of Ireland, and then they're successful up to 1803. And then after 1803, afterwards, that's when you got all these penal laws coming in. And the Irish then, from my understanding, and Rambling Kern can easily correct me on this one, it's from that point onwards that we're seeing the Irish starting to hide their weapons and stuff. Even before that, with the William Knight and Jacobite Wars, where you have various laws, continuous laws coming out and causing the Irish try to hide their weapons, especially since other Irish had been killed previously for walking around with their weapons and stuff. Because before then, it is very interesting because we have an cattle raiding society, which leads to a dueling society, a very martial arts society. But as you pointed out there earlier, a lot of it's not documented. It's not until the Irish start breaking out into the wider world that's when we start to see a lot of this documented, to our own frustration. Because I was going to say that to you earlier, is that Viking wrestling is very much, well, to a certain degree, is documented. So I was curious, how much of that, of the Scandinavian wrestling styles, how much do you think would have influenced Ireland, if not whatsoever? Because they do look different, especially collar and elbow and the Glima style of wrestling that you see, where it's more kind of back heavy by the looks of it.
Yes.
Do you think there's any influences there, or do you think
Oh,
there's none?
For sure, yeah. From chatting to some of the backup guys in Scotland, I got to visit them a
Mm,
backup club in Edinburgh last year, at the end of last year. They were saying one thing that you they definitely think there was a bit of Scandinavian influence because there is a style of Glima, which is the traditional Scandinavian style of wrestling, Icelandic.
mm,
We get waters getting a bit muddy, but they do a style that is back holds. So they basically hold up over the back. I think the grips might be slightly different. Um, so there probably is quite a bit of crossover with those. Um, it was interesting what they were saying to me though, and actually tie it back a little bit into what I was saying about the things you see in artwork about the currents kind of stuffing guys' hands and reaching forward. This is something I
mm,
teach in stick fighting. It's like if someone hold on, I might get an angle where you can see me. But if someone loads up an arm to swing at you, often you'll try to shoot your arm in here and wrap up their arm. Um, which results in your left arm being there and your right arm being over the shoulder to try to control their arm, which is what you see mirrored with those back hold styles, which would also make sense
mm,
with your Vikings because they have a big shield. If you can stuff that to their body and control their arm, they're kind of stuck. Now, a lot of the Lima today, I believe, is belt orientated. So they wear these like, this looks like a climbing harness. But I do think the back hold styles really influence each other across that kind of Scottish Danelaw area and then down into Ireland from there. Because
mm, mm, mm.
if I'm getting my facts right, I do think that the north of Ireland was very much more prominent with the backhaul styles of wrestling than the rest of the country was.
That's very, very fascinating. All right, like because we were talking about yesterday, even the influences of hurling into the wider Viking world, how you can see hurling making its way up to Scotland and Iceland and stuff and start to influence the culture of those regions. So, given that there's so much wrestling was happening during those periods, it wouldn't be a surprise to me that you would have Scandinavians and Irish wrestling and then, influencing each other. Like, I'd be surprised if they didn't have that happening, especially as you can see there, the weapons are so similar, especially when you're dealing with bucklers and you've got the much more larger Viking shields and stuff. Would they not influence each other as well? So it's so fascinating that you point out that actually even today with collar and elbow and stuff, you're still seeing those influences being passed down. Although you're not the biggest fan of somebody just turning around suddenly and saying, "Hey, look, you can't turn around and say it's the same fighting style 1,000 years ago, but there may have been bits that have survived."
100%. Like
Mm,
there's definitely a history to these things. And I would say if you were to like, I mean, not even to say, we know thankfully through like Asian sources, if you look at wrestling done even 1,000 years ago with some of the depictions we see, they look almost identical to what you see today. Um,
mm,
but obviously the nuances around them and how we do them, how we practice them have changed. So it's
mm,
it's not to say that they didn't do it. It's just to say that it's definitely not an unbroken lineage from that person right the way down, as you do see in Japan in some cases.
mm,
We don't have that, unfortunately, due to the history that we have. Um, one thing I wanted to mention, because you brought it up there, is a really great point that the shift from group combat into a dueling society and then almost back into
mm,
group combat is a really interesting one on it because the we wrote the dueling code. So for those who
mm,
don't know, there is a dueling code. It's what gentlemen all across Europe practiced and into North America. It was written in Ireland. It was written by the Irish as a way to settle disputes. I love it because it gives you so many options to back out of the duel. And I believe the first one was written in Tipperary, but it's a very clear set of like, how have they slighted you, why have they slighted you, have a think on it, make sure you have a second, all the things that we see in various different films. And it was written um, in Ireland, which really goes to show that we really had a very, very heavy duel based society or dueling based society for quite a while. Um, I did a video a while back on a duel that happened in Dublin Castle between two Kerns. And It's something I talked about in recent, like most recent video of just how we like to think of fighting as being this kind of beautiful thing, but the fight itself was so brutal that the powers that be in Dublin Castle said we're never having a duel here again, which is not what we're
Jesus
um,
Christ.
So my details are right, I think one of the guys took one of the guy's eyes out with a sword, and then he ended up getting his sword lodged in the other guy's leg, and then the other guy basically grabbed him by the helmet and pulled his head back and took his head off. Um, to which the crowd were just left there stunned watching this. Um,
I can imagine.
people hoping it would be first blood and that's lovely. It's just it's absolutely, behaving in front of them.
What year is this?
I believe it is the late 1500s. I must check this because it's on my channel,
Oh, I'm so surprised there.
the account of it, but it's yeah, it's pretty grim, like, and it's something that I think people just kind of gloss over it of like, yeah, yeah, dueling was this lovely, like, nice thing that you see, and people were um just tip tapping around with swords, and you get a little look and good day, sir. You know,
Mm.
there's plenty of accounts of guys running each other through with swords and then continuing to try beat each other to death. It was when people had a serious gripe and the adrenaline got pumping, it was a pretty nasty set of circumstances that they were fighting in. Where
Yeah, it's fascinating because at the same time they're trying to avoid getting blood feuds with each other, which it does happen, as you said there. When somebody's got red mist, that's it. They're 100 miles an hour. But at the same time, cattle raiding is there to try to prevent a lot of blood feuds happening between Finn war bands or Kern war bands. But as you said there, when you're reading the likes of the Finn cycle and stuff, and you've got Finn McCool, who hates that other guy so much, they get into a fight with each other. The red mist is going. They suddenly kill that person. That warband is going to, have a blood feud with them, and it becomes tick for tat until eventually, the Brehon judges come in there. Fines are paid allegedly, but once again, with the Fin cycle, even if fines are paid and they're meant to be shaking hands and stuff, there's still that kind of like, we'll get our own back next time. Like, so it is fascinating, as you said there, how, red mist can cause so much anger between two groups, but at the same time, there's meant to be a society, especially since it's meant to be more, orientated towards cattle raiding, just steal the cattle. You don't need to get into any blood feuds. Boys will be with boys, but they're still, as you said, they're causing, because they're using real weapons, things are escalating in our hand, like, for sure.
Yeah, so I just checked that year was 1583 as well. So
1503.
it was a pretty grim one. But I mean it's literally as I said, Stephen, come on. It's one thing as well with the style of warfare, especially in the 1500s, like we have this very cattle riding heavy society, like you were saying, and I think a lot of the style of warfare we were up to is really influenced by that. Well, obviously it is, but I think there's this weird distinction people have in Ireland now, especially when people start to talk about that period, where they think that Irish warfare was like these two very distinctive groups. So the what I always say, like people think the Gallagher, the Kern, like these very very different things.
Mm,
And as far as we can see in history, they weren't as such. Um, the Gallowgas tended early on to be very specific. We're coming from Scotland and the Hebrides. We are these uh, like warrior groups who are known for fighting in a specific way.
mm,
The Irish are known for fighting in their way. As time progresses, the Gallowgas families that we see, especially in the north of Ireland, are essentially just like family dynasties who just they are landed in order to kind of tame them a little bit, so to speak. And the Irish kind of end up looking and fighting exactly the same as they do. There's a great picture from a Scottish book of a lot of guys hunting deer, and they look exactly like Kerns. They're wearing the inner with the like they're laying it flapping in the wind, shooting that same sort of kind of gold wing recurve bow I was talking about. Um, but I think the bit that gets confusing is that what I think was more true to the world is that people talk about Kerns and Gallowglass as two distinctive groups. I think it was more so who had the money to afford the kit. I think if you're an Irish guy and you could afford a bit of armor and a gun, you're going to fight with that. And if you couldn't,
Mm,
you're going to fight with a spear and a bit of a wicker shield and hope for the best.
mm,
Um, I think there's this very bit much a push to think of it like a video game where you have like a block of Gallagher, a block of Kearns, but in reality, they probably all look very similar to each other, with a few lads having a bit more money than the others. What are your lads' thoughts on hurling as a training method for cattle rated and style running battles? So I would love to see more research into that, Stephen, because it's something that, especially early games of hurling, for anyone who's not familiar with hurling, I know we might have some people outside of Ireland who don't really know. We have a traditional game in Ireland called hurling, which is played with a hurl. It's similar to land hockey, but quite different. And it is considered, I think, the fastest like on land ball game. Um, but traditionally, how it was played was similar to what you see actually early football in England, where it was basically one group or town would try to get possession of the ball and try to keep it in their area, and the other group would try to get it off them, and they would basically, fight each other with those sticks or hurls, which they're called, in order to get it back. Um, I think there probably was a lot of using it to condition groups to work together, and work
mm,
together as a team, especially like to organize groups. Um, Anyone who's ever like taken part in reenactments or anything like that, um, I heard a great quote about a historian talking about the Battle of Gettysburg, and they were saying like, oh, if you could get a machine gun at Gettysburg, like where do you put it? What would be the most amazing modern weapon you could get to change the course of that battle? And he said a walkie-talkie.
yeah.
If you could talk to someone on the other side of that battle and tell them this thing's happening over there, it would change the course of everything. So I think if you have something like hurling where you're getting these groups to figure out how to talk and communicate and work in groups, especially if it isn't like cattle raiding where it has to be done quickly, because if they get the jump on you, you could be getting gravely hurt or killed. And something that I find people don't really talk about a huge amount when we're talking about fighting in the past is, you know, people talk about, oh, you might die from your wound later. Sometimes it's not necessarily the wound. Sometimes it's the inability to work.
Mm,
If you have a hand chopped off or an arm broken, you might not be able to work, and you might go destitute or like lose your life from lack of ability to provide for yourself. And
mm,
that's true in Ireland, especially right the way up until the late 1800s. So definitely, I think it was something that would have been used in that capacity. I mean, again, we don't know for sure, but with the nature of Ireland at the time, I would not be surprised if lads were specifically using that for training for battle or and cattle raids, especially.
mm. Yeah, yeah, I definitely 100% agree with you the way that the hurling is set up. For anybody who doesn't know or never seen hurling before, it's the national sport of Ireland, where it's actually one of the fastest sports in the world. And so it'll lay the ball and chuck it into the air with the old hurley stick and go 1,000 miles an hour, passing it amongst the lads and stuff. But like even the way it goes off into loose formations and stuff, where lads are chasing the ball and stuff, you could easily see that with the cattle raider. Anytime you see depictions or drawings like in churches where they're show, they have sketches and stuff. I think it's around Clare. There's a monastic church up around there, and it's got sketching, drawing of a cattle raid, and they're all in loose formation. Mm. Compared to, and it goes back to what we were saying earlier, how we have more descriptions up in the northeast of the island of sorry, northwest of the island, where you have more descriptions of loose formations and stuff, which fits perfectly, for tougher bogland trees. But then when we're looking at warfare from the southeast side, it seems to be more closer formations where cavalry just dominates. Like English cavalry can easily win a good few battles, especially around the Leinster region and stuff. But those, English cavalry and stuff really seem to struggle, from my opinion, up in the northwest of the island, where it seems to be the hobbler horse, much more light horses seem to dominate. And then even more so, again, the Kerns seem to dominate those regions and stuff. Although once those Gallo glass come in, with more gammonson, with fitted mail, proper armor to defend themselves and stuff, they seem to be able to push back, especially against the English knights and stuff. And as you were pointing out as well, with those Dane axes early on, and then the evolution into the Sparta axe, um, become very feared amongst English knights and stuff, especially with the fear of getting their horse decapitated on the battlefield, which must have been some sight in itself.
And it's an interesting thing to see actually, like because even up into the late 1500s, you see in a lot of depictions, especially with O'Neill and the warfare he was getting up to. There's a drawing I was looking at recently of a battle, or at least I forget, it's just like a formation of the O'Neills, or if it's an actual fight, with that they're
Mm,
depicted. It's big pike blocks, which was obviously imported from the continental style of fighting into Ireland,
mm,
and then there's burns everywhere, and they're all like
yeah.
loosely drawn all over the battlefield because it was still that way of fighting. It was like, this is how we win. We drive each other with pikes. We're still gonna have all these little ones running around firing javelins at you and shooting rifles in at you.
Mm,
Um, so the style of warfare just kept being effective. So obviously the lads just kept doing it. And you see like loads of guys in bushes shooting, muskets at each other. The I mean, probably the best example of that being used to be Glenmalure. Um, the Leo Burns up in the Wicklow Mountains drawing the the English up into the Valley of Glenmalure and having at them with weapons where they weren't able to get their pikes to hand. Um, More than I was 4,000 years old.
mm,
Yeah. So an interesting point with Brian there, I guess, like the ritual side of things. I mean, that's kind of what we were talking about earlier with the idea of like recreational violence.
mm,
It's something that I just think people have always craved.
yeah.
It's what a lot of modern sport fills in for us today. And I know people have different levels they like, but I mean, if you look at how tribalistic like modern day soccer is, it's a prime example of it. It's blue versus red. We're gonna defeat you. But it was just way back when that was being used for
Well,
like
it's Professor. What's his name was in my head a few seconds ago until I heard the echo of my voice again. Every time I hear my own voice, my brain just goes blank. But regardless, was it one of the professors down in University College of Cork? No, my brain just doesn't want to work hearing myself back. But regardless, he pointed out that the whole reason of having the word Ugluk in there, which means young warrior, and would have been the military service you did between the age of 14 to 25, was to go out there and kind of get the whole kind of teen angst out of you, that kind of anger and rage that you have, shove it out in the countryside, get yourself involved with cattle raids and stuff. Boys will be boys, go out there, steal cattle here, steal cattle there, and then obviously people who don't inherit the land and stuff go on to stay on as Kern, and continue those war bands out in the countryside and stuff. So you're bang on right. I think it's Professor John Carey. That's the one. He constantly would highlight the fact of, why would you have that military service, especially in times of peace and stuff. And it's a case of you going out, living on the borders of society, doing what you want, which is, excess drinking, rolling around with, certain types of women. And on top of that as well, going out there, committing cattle raid and stuff, and kind of getting those angst out of you. So yeah, it's definitely something people definitely support within the academic world of what you said there.
Yeah, and it's something that the dogfighting group went part of that stick fighting group I mentioned earlier. It's something that we talk about is the lack of kind of a rites of passage for young men these days.
Mm,
We see a lot of things being used to fill that void, whereas historically there was this was what you did. Like society would set this thing very firmly in place. I mean, you can
mm,
see right the way back in history, all the way back in, like you mentioned, in Ireland and throughout Europe, there's these very specific, you do this thing, that is your rite of passage as a young man. And usually it is to kind of deal with that bit of testosterone that's probably better used for something constructive or rather than destructive. Um, and especially I think these sort of sports would really help to fill that gap, but also keep warriors busy when there wasn't anything else to do. Because especially when we've seen plenty of revolutions and similar happen across the world because soldiers didn't have anything to do.
Yeah, that's very true. Right. We might if you guys do you guys have any more questions there in the comment section? Seem to have gone very quiet right now.
Nice. Yeah, fire out a few before we get ahead, folks.
Right, what we might start doing there, because we're on the hour and a half point, and I assume you've got other things to be doing tomorrow and stuff, so we might start finishing up there. First and foremost, right, I need to apologize to you there, Rambling Kern. Normally, these
No worries.
photos, this is the first time I've ever had this bug where these photos are not working on screen. Myself and the Rambling Kern, by the way, we can see these photos. Restream, on the other hand, they have a million and one excuses at me, which I have no clue what's going on there. I'll have a word with them after anyway, because it's the Patreon money is going towards paying for this restream, which is costing about 20 quid to about 80 quid. So not very good on that side of things, but it is what it is. And secondly, I apologize to myself because anytime I've been talking tonight, I've been hearing the echo of myself. Another massive bug on restream side of things. So, it is what it is when you're doing what was it called, a live stream. You have all this kind of mad stuff happening. So we've managed. I just want to thank the Rambling Kern for rolling through this and adapting through. Somehow we've managed to get to the other side of this. Which means a ton to myself. So thank you so much for that, Rambling Kern. Guys, definitely head on over to his channel there, the Rambling Kern on YouTube. 1 second, see if I can. Oh yeah, there it is. So if you look at the very bottom there, you can see the Rambling Kern. I don't know if you can see that. There we go. There's the spelling for the Rambling Kern. So head on over to his YouTube channel. Um, you were talking about classes before, and you've been talking about classes for a good few a while now. What's the story with your classes? And also on top of that as well, you're mostly making your money these days through the classes and stuff. You don't have any Patreon or anything like that, do you?
Yes, I do need
Nice.
So all of our different forms of revenue. So Patreon, it's still under the Rambling Kern. You'll find me on there as
Nice.
well, and it's linked in pretty much all the videos. We have different tiers. We have a private Discord there where we all chat about random stuff, different things we get up to. For those who want to train in stick fighting or stuff like that online, I don't like doing class formats. I like to do stuff one on one because especially people
Mm.
different levels. If that interests you, I think it's about 30 quid a month, something like that. So like the minimum is about the cost of a cup of coffee, about 3 quid. So if that interests you, come and join the party. If you want to train with me in person, I run classes every week in Inchicore, which is in Dublin 8. So if you're ever in Dublin, if you might be abroad, feel free to drop down anytime. Again, you'll find links in all my videos to my classes. I teach Irish stick fighting every Thursday. I also teach sumo. So my other thing I do, I actually compete in the British Isles Open this weekend. Um, and I teach Color Noble. If you're interested in Color Noble, colornoble.ie is a website. We have a lot of events all over the world coming this year. If you want to have me travel to your country and teach, I also do that regularly. I will be flying out next month, almost every month from now till August. So if there's somewhere in the world you want me to go and you have a group who want to train with me in Irish Color Noble or stick fighting or some of the various mad things I do, feel free to get in touch. And I will be building the shed in the next month or two, so we'll have even more shenanigans on the channel making and destroying stuff.
Brilliant. Right, that's us. Obviously, next Sunday is the next live stream I'll be covering with you guys. I'll see what we can do in between there. I don't know what's going on between myself and YouTube these days, but regardless, we'll be back on for, what was it, Saturday night for you guys, American and Irish time. If you're over in Australia and in Asia, it'll be Sunday morning. And we'll be covering the clans and dynasties of Ireland with Mihal and Dr. Owen O'Neill. So definitely head on over then to check out your own clan dynasty, so on and so forth. Also, on top of that, guys, over on Patreon on Sunday night, we'll be covering the administration of the Lordship of Ireland in the 13th century. So definitely, if you're interested in any of that type of stuff, head on over to the Patreon. It's about 20 quid a month. Not too bad for a bunch of classes every Sunday night. But other than that, guys, thank you so much for that. And I'll see you guys later. Slán go all, yeah.
Thank you all.